Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation? The podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Chris Marshall. Chris Marshall is an engaging speaker, behavioral futurist, executive coach, and author with a unique perspective on human potential. He uses his diverse career journey spanning behavioral science, global macro strategy, ski racing, and Master Distiller to help people manage fast-paced change effectively and achieve their goals. Chris's expertise in economics, history, neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and trend research offers practical strategies and tools that enhance resilience, creativity, innovation, and adaptability. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for this conversation. I can't wait.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's an absolute honor to be with you here.
I appreciate that. We're going to dive right in. What, in your mind, is innovation?
I'm going to sum this up really simply. For me, innovation is human nature. That's where it is. I basically can go anywhere now with that answer. But for me, obviously my skill set, as we were talking just before we hit record, reaches these two different fields, and two fields which are often kept separate. And I believe need to be brought together to understand things. And that is being a professional futurist and being a behavioral scientist. And when you start looking at this, one of our greatest talents as human beings is our ability to adapt, to innovate and create. What's really interesting is that when we start diving into that and we start looking at some of the problems in the modern world, and we can dive into why we've got rising fear and pessimism and everything else, is that our ability to have those core attributes, those very human nature things, rests on us being not stressed. When we start to get into a stress state, and this is where we come all the way back to innovation. Innovation is stressful because it creates uncertainty. And the faster the innovation, the more uncertainty. I think you see where I'm going with this.
Yes.
But at its core, human beings, we are innovative creatures. We're responding to the impermanence of the world around us and the natural environment. We are endlessly curious. You only have to look at babies and children. And it's that process which brings together sometimes wacky thoughts that innovators have. And the ones which actually do something good, i.e. progress humanity, are the ones which stick and we all then pile on top of and we go, I'd like a piece of that. And they can be small things, they can be paradigm shifts, and everything in between.
Right. So the scale is not necessarily a reflection of whether something is innovative or not.
No, I don't think so. I think the scale of the innovation comes down to how desperately we needed that solution.
As humans.
As humans, yeah, absolutely. So I'm gonna kind of paraphrase Thomas Sowell, who has like a 1,000,001 amazing quotes.
Yeah, very quotable.
I should just have them up on screen and just read out his stuff. But he says something along the lines of today's solutions are tomorrow's problems. But he's absolutely right. And one of the things that we overlook is we look for the perfect solution. Every innovation believes it's struck gold and it's found the answer. And then we go, actually, there was a trade-off. And that's not bad. I mean, that's just the process. And when the world itself is changing around you, and yes, we talk about that now as if it's a new thing, the world's been through these cycles. It's been through cold periods, hot periods. We might, as humans, be speeding it up, but the world is kind of on its cycle. When you have a changing natural environment, everything which is on top of that, which is everything on the planet, also has to adapt and change.
Yeah, that's such an insightful way of thinking about innovation and connecting it directly to our human nature and the humanity as who we are. Because I think a lot of times the context is so shallow in which we talk about innovation. We stop at technology, or we stop at creativity, or we stop at these sorts of things that, in your definition, immediately become clear are domains or context for innovation, but not innovation itself.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think this is one of the things. So often when I'm talking to audiences or on podcasts like yours, one of the kind of things that I pull out is, so when I was doing the research behind Decoding Change, the book, I mean, obviously the book was kind of trying to give people a framework to see how the world changes. Bizarrely, it's one of the topics we don't teach anybody. We teach people about disruptive technology, or we teach people about cultural change. We don't teach the massive, well, how does the world change? How does society change? How does we go through these phases? One of the tools I'm increasingly finding that resonates with people is the idea that the world is in layers. And very simply, you have these little different layers that update at their own speeds, i.e. they have their own cycle time. Top layer, we could insert products. If you've ever worked in retail or just shopped generally, then you'll know that products update pretty quickly. That could be annually, seasonally, monthly, weekly, whatever time scale. And so that goes through its own product cycle. Below that, we have businesses. Businesses update slower than their products. That's intuitive. We get that. When you see, I don't know, somebody like Apple, they're not one product, they're multiple products. They update their products, but Apple remains. Eventually, Apple won't. I hate to say that to the superfans. But just like Kodak was 90% of film processing in the world, they got taken out by the digital camera. I mean, sad story, they invented it, but they didn't keep up with the product line. Below business, you then get to infrastructure. And infrastructure really is where we start talking about disruptive technologies. This is the paradigm shifting stuff. So we could put in here James Stephenson's steam engine. We could put George Stephenson's locomotive. We could put the semiconductor in the 1970s. What I would call paradigm shifts. And what they do is they suddenly reorganize what's the best way to do something as a business.
Does that word sudden, is that critical?
I think it's sudden from the point of view of the person in the firm. So this is actually one of the things I try and bring out is that these trends take decades to come through. If you think the semiconductor was invented in, I think it's 1971. Okay. And we're putting it to use more and more, but you can't say, oh my word, when the internet arrived in 1990, whatever it was, that it was like the technology behind it was brand new. It wasn't. So you're absolutely right. But there's this kind of, this thing in us, human inertia. And we like to go, well, this is the way we've always done it. Let's take Kodak. That's a great example of this. No, we know film processing. We're kitted out for that. Our infrastructure is built on that paradigm. We're not built for digital. We're going to stick with that, and we believe it's got a future.
And that's probably sound business doctrine. From an orthodoxy standpoint. I'm sure no one said, oh, you're crazy for continuing to do what got you 90% market share.
And you can't chase everything. I mean, that's the other thing. There is a kind of a limit to how many times you can just pivot and change your business model. And you've also got to kind of accept that some of these things, as they're developing, new businesses or a tiny research team might be interested in them, but they're at the fringes. They're the things which most people are going, nah, no way, that doesn't work. Let's take crypto assets. Certainly going through a really bad time at the moment. The SEC in the US is just, basically just kind of really run a knife through there. But the actual blockchain behind it, that's still potentially, in my view, got a massive future. And we see this. I obviously spend quite a lot of my time in the investment world. And you see this when you study the history of markets, you start to see this. You start to see the euphoria of new inventions. And then you see a bubble. And then you see the bubble pop as people go, oh, we haven't quite learned how to apply this to business yet. Everybody got excited by any company that had a domain name in 2000. It didn't matter if you had any revenue. It was just, oh, wow, they're called pets.com. They must be good. Pets.com didn't have a business. But they had this massive market cap. And we could take the same with railroads, automotive stocks, telephone stocks, whatever era. And so, you're absolutely right. Businesses can't just pivot. But the companies which fail to, at that critical point, then basically just see themselves either taken out by the next best thing, or they just don't stay on the leaderboard anymore. The company that harnesses the next best technology, the one that comes next, will top the charts as the world's biggest company because it's using the best thinking. But what we've got to do with these layers, coming back to this, we've kind of talked about the top three. Most people stop there. But to really understand how the world changes. So we are now going beyond innovation slightly, but we could kind of squeeze this into kind of global change. There are 3 other layers that I talk about.
Oh, wow. 3 beyond infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And their regulation, culture, and the natural environment, they all update on different cycles as well. They tend to be slower because they're responding to the upper layers. What's really interesting, though, is you can't say that something which is slow is not meaningful or it's not important. In fact, the opposite relationship exists. When the natural environment moves, it's the magnitude it brings with it. The kind of how big a change happens is just unbelievable. And that's the same all the way through the layers. So products, when products update, you and me can go, okay, so we missed this season's t-shirt, iPhone, whatever.
Right.
It doesn't really matter too much. But when you start getting to missing the changes as you come down the structure, the more significant it becomes. What's different right now is, I would say for the past 200 years or so, we've been quite used to kind of things filtering down. We've seen a few paradigm shifting technologies at the infrastructure level. They tend to happen every 50 to 60 years. But the rest of the time, we just see things nice and calmly chip away at things. It's kind of just incremental innovation from the product to the business, all on the same paradigm. And then regulation, culture, and natural environment, we don't really have to pay too much attention to. It's much the same as it was 10 years ago. Now, we're in a world which is flipped. And the trends and megatrends are occurring at every single layer. It's no longer just filtering down. We actually have trends originating at every layer. So we've got feedback loops going up. We've got feedback loops coming down.
I see. And our societal norms and social construct and business constructs are organized around this sort of trickle down model.
Yeah.
I see. And what's disrupting things is the fact that change is happening at every layer all at once.
Yeah. So it's not just, for example, it's not just regulation is changing as a response to infrastructure and business. It's changing as basically a response to the changing natural environment and the changing philosophy of culture.
So the cause-effect relationship is what has changed.
Yeah.
Is what has shifted.
Absolutely.
I see.
Yeah. Again, let's take a really big step back. When you look at the biggest changes in human history, in global history, then the biggest ones happen at that natural environment. There are cycles of we said, cold periods, which we call ice ages, and warm periods. And those are incredibly, they're way bigger than anything we want to go through.
Right.
And then you get to the cultural philosophy layer. And really, we haven't had a massive shift in that. I'm going to say since really the start of the Industrial Revolution. And that ushered in a kind of a mechanized approach to everything. We tend to think of it being a mechanized approach to production. I'd say it's a mechanized approach to thinking. And you get management systems and you get kind of all these KPIs. And if you do this, you get that. And I think we're now on the shift again. So, again, in my research, I talk about the next era as being kind of conceptualized by this age of awareness.
Interesting.
And the age of awareness is this cultural philosophy shift of we're using all the data from the previous era, which really the semiconductor did that. Suddenly we're allowed to record stuff like we are now.
Right.
And data sets and everything else. And now we're able to use that. We're going through an information revolution right now. AI is accelerating that once again.
Right.
Every time you've had an information revolution in history, so we could go back to the Gutenberg Press.
That's the first one that came to mind. Yeah.
All of a sudden, the information was far more readily available in people's hands. Not completely, and not everybody could still access it. Having a book was still something of wealth.
Right.
But then once we got to the telephone, that's the next one I say. And we overlook the telephone because we're like, oh, telephone, like it's such a simple bit of kit. But if you kind of think what the telephone did, if we had troops on the front line, I'm speaking from Europe, I'm speaking from North Wales, on the front line in Ukraine, and it was in the era pre-telephone, I'd have to send a messenger, like to ride on his horse or get on a boat and everything else. It would probably take him a couple of weeks to get there. I would have no idea if that message is being delivered until 4 weeks later, he returns. My general might have at that point gone, no, I'm not listening to you. In which you send another letter. And you can see how the telephone suddenly just changed that. There was now instantaneous intercontinental communication. And it's no surprise that we then get into this kind of the age of science, the age of reason, the golden age of discovery, which came at the same time.
Right.
And now I think we're in the next one. And it's no surprise, therefore, if the pattern continues, that we see a cultural philosophy shift at the same time.
That's important stuff to consider and to kind of wrap our heads around. And as you talked about the Gutenberg Press, it made me think back to a comment you made earlier about some of the unintended consequences of things. And the glass industry was improved dramatically with the democratization of printed books because people found out they were nearsighted. They didn't know they couldn't see because they weren't trying to read.
I didn't know that story. I love that story.
And so they found out that they couldn't see. And so then people said, okay, well, let's make corrective lenses. And the tolerances on lenses were more important, which made glass blowing and the entire glass industry improve their regulations and their tolerances around what they could do. And I think that unintended consequence is one of those where you almost have to go back and dig and figure out and connect dots. And I don't even know how someone figured that out. It's mind blowing. But it makes me think about what you're talking about in terms of where we are today. I know it's popular to talk about some of the doom and gloom sides of what technology and some of the technologically driven innovation work that's going on, what that could bring. But I think it's already starting to generate some unintended consequences around at least the conversations around what the future is going to look like. I think people were sort of complacent about it. And I wonder if you see in your work and your conversations with people, being a futurist, if you see a different level of interest in your craft and your expertise as this new age that we're in is washing over people.
Yeah, I think I do. I'm certainly, there's more of an audience for my topics than if I was talking about these things 20 years ago.
Right.
So I was speaking to an audience in central London a few months ago. And I got the audience just as I said, put your hand up if you feel like the world's undergoing rapid change. And 99% of them put their hand up. And then I said, okay, well, keep your hand up if you can pinpoint where that change is coming from. And all but two people put their hand down, which was really, I mean, it was a bit cruel. I was expecting this. And the reason it's cruel is because we all feel the world is changing. But where would this pessimism and fear is coming from? And increasing stress and increasing anxiety and addictive behaviors. We can link all of these. For me, is the increasing uncertainty. That when things are very clear, even if they're moving fast, we can cope. But when everything's on the move, so going back to the idea of layers, when all of these different layers are basically being thrown up in the air, then this is when we as humans, our psychology changes, actually our physiology changes. Our brain chemistry changes, and we actually change states. We go from being in this calm kind of rest and digest system, which we kind of link with homeostasis and growth and repair, to a situation where our body is anticipating that there's a huge threat ahead. And we basically bring online, maybe not full blown, but we bring online that fight and flight response, which was designed to get us away from a lion or a bear, but we've got that stress jammer buzzed on. And when you do that, and this is so now the other side of my work, as you know, kind of as a behavioral scientist and coach, is I deal with a lot of people and really trying to educate them and teach them how to deal with uncertainty. Because for me, in the next 20, 30 years, if we're right that the world's undergoing this massive radical social change, disruptive change is basically the same thing as uncertainty. The ground you're standing on, the status quo, is no longer going to exist. You're going to have to adapt. Now, the issue with that is that when you're in a stress state, you don't want to adapt.
I see. Yeah.
You're not adaptive, you're not creative, you're not innovative.
Right.
Actually, we could take this on a relationship level. You're disengaged to people. You can't be empathetic. You're far closer to being kind of populist, nationalist, isolationist. You see things flare up. And when you look back through history, again, the thing which is really incredible here is you tie the biggest times of change to when people were the most pessimistic.
Oh.
And when we look back, we go, that was an incredible period for humanity. So there's this kind of juxtaposition. In the short term, disruptive change is really uneasy. It's not a nice thing.
Disorienting almost.
Yeah, absolutely. But in the long term, it's how humanity progresses. For me, I'm going to bring this to a very big statement. The world really does have some hurdles, and I have to be careful saying this because it can sound like I'm saying, oh, there's nothing to worry about. I'm not. But I believe so fully in the ability of human nature, its innovative nature, its adaptability, its creativity, that all of the hurdles we see ahead are more than within our abilities. But, and this is the caveat, the existential threat to humanity is found in our thinking. Because if we remain on this path of increasing anxiety and stress, firstly, we don't have an optimistic outlook. And secondly, we actually cut off the brain areas which allow us to be that incredibly adaptive species.
Wow. Right. So when we need it most, we're actually putting it in a drawer and pushing it away because of the sort of knee-jerk reaction to the uncertainty that this era represents.
Yeah, so essentially what we're talking about here is chronic stress.
Okay.
It wouldn't necessarily be labeled that because we have this very kind of black and white view of stress in the world that we believe that we're either stressed out or fine. And that's not actually the case.
True. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
It's a scale.
Yeah.
And even being at level, I don't know, if we put joy and calm, joy is a scientific word, by the way, it's this inner state of happiness. So if level 1 is joy, this is where you have those abstract thinking moments. People normally associate it with walking, running, yoga, shower. Right. You're just calm. You're able to access all your mind. And then at the other end, we have level 5, which is stressed out. People kind of only talk about those two, but there's all the shades in between. And so what we're talking about is stress by itself is not bad. Okay, stress can be energizing and motivating and everything else. Chronic stress, when we go into a stress state and don't come back, that's when we start to see all these maladaptive processes and we start to see relationships fail and we start to see people can't cooperate and we start to see pessimism and all of these other things happen.
And I can imagine then that by extension, those maladaptive processes happen at the different layers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there could be maladaptive regulations that are created.
Yeah. And anything where you've basically got human intervention because we're not thinking properly, we're not thinking clearly. Our decision making is becoming more biased because we want instant gratification. We want this solved. I mean, let's just take this back to kind of our evolutionary biology. When you're in a stress state, what your body is telling you is sending you an emotional signal. That's how your nervous system communicates with your brain, is it sends an emotion. And it's meant to just be a little red flag. It's like, hey, just hold on a minute. There's a lion outside. Emotions are actually meant to last 90 seconds. When I say that to most people, they go, hold on a minute. I can hold on to them for months. And you're like, yeah. But that's what neuroscientists and brain scientists are finding is they're meant to just be attention-grabbing moments. And yeah, you're absolutely right, is that this can happen at any layer where there's human intervention because what we're doing is we're changing not just how we're processing information, not just how we form a decision, but we actually change what information we take in. And I think that's really important because the world is so complex and rich that we can't actually take in all the data. We have to simplify.
Right.
We have to choose what we pay attention to. And guess what? When you're in a really pessimistic, stressed out state, do you think you look for all the positive things or do you think you look for all the threats? And so that instantly frames all of your decision-making process. I'm in the final throes of writing my second book.
Oh, wow.
Which is called Pause, Pause, Move. And it's this idea of we need to insert 2 pauses before we make a decision when we're operating in a high-stake, fast-paced environment.
Oh, wow.
The first pause is looking inside, which, by the way, as humans, we hate doing. I know we all love to go on a meditation walk or this and that or the other, but in daily life, we actually don't really like kind of considering our own thinking because it's scary and it takes a little bit of courage.
Right.
But until you've controlled that stress state, your perception of the world is always going to be biased and tainted. So pause 1 is a micro pause. You can do this in 3 breaths. It doesn't have to be a holiday to Bali or wherever.
Right.
It can be just done in a few seconds.
Right.
And then the second pause is then asking, what don't I know? And that's another bit that we don't like to do because we like to think that we know everything and that it's all logical and everything. So the second pause is then, once you're in the right state, you can then be curious. And I think this is one of the key things of the human, like it's our superpower, our curiosity. Bring this back to human nature and innovation. Curiosity allows us to take different perspectives. It allows us to actually come together as a community.
Yeah.
Because we can see other people's thinking. We can see where they've arrived at, even if we disagree with their thoughts.
If you're open to being influenced by them, or to hearing them, I should say.
Or at least open-minded. And again,
Yes.
that's a thing that we can bring back to our biology and our chemistry. You're not open-minded when you're stressed. You're rigid. You're closed-minded. When you're in this state of joy and calm and happiness, you can kind of go, yeah, I'm happy with my ideas. What's yours? It's a very, very different place. And that's where we need to get more people in the world. Firstly, because there's this paradox, this double-edged sword, that to overcome the hurdles that stand up in front of us, we need to be more innovative, more creative. We're actually going the other way.
Right.
And secondly, there's so much kind of fear, pessimism, as I said, nationalism, kind of the splitting of societies. All of this is going to add to our inability to create.
Right.
And I think we're on this tipping point of understanding stress. And it's so key.
My mind is exploding with all the kind of questions and thoughts that generated. The thing I think is most important in what you're saying that I want to make sure I understand is the relationship between stress and risk management. Because in the world of innovation, as people get together to innovate, teams get together to innovate, organizations gather around innovation, as you go out beyond that individual person to sort of innovate as a construct, the flip side of that coin is always risk, which to me feels like a means of trying to manage the disruptive change you were talking about, the uncertainty you were talking about. And in my experience, it has often been the brakes on the innovation process or the cap on the outcomes you can get from innovation. But it feels like it's a natural, I've been thinking about that as you were talking, it feels like almost a natural sort of balance to innovation and change and moving forward. But I wonder, from a behavioral scientist and futurist, I'm just an armchair behavioral scientist, what you think about how that works as a mechanism, innovation, risk management, those sorts of things.
Yeah, okay. So let's kind of just unpack this a little bit. So in terms of risk management, I guess you're kind of digging into, do people take more risky decisions or less risky decisions?
In one decision, how do you weigh those things, especially in an environment of uncertainty and change?
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is where it is very individual. A lot of behavioral science has grouped everybody together into things. But what you actually find is that people can actually go either way. They can become more risk adverse, i.e. they want less risk, or they can actually become risk seekers.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not clear cut that people go one way. But what is more clear cut is the reaction is more extreme. So when you're actually not so stressed, what seems to happen is that your kind of reactions are slightly more muted. I guess they're kind of more normal, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
When you're actually in this state of stress, certainly if you're really fearful of the future and everything else, you might actually undertake risk-taking behaviors. And we can think about this from some of the things that people do, which really aren't healthy behaviors. So I'm thinking about investment management, but there's lots of other things in life. Is that, an investor loses some money on a portfolio, so they double down on a stock which they would have never have bought before, but it has the potential to double their money because it now seems a good idea to get back.
Right.
And so you can see these extreme behaviors. And the reason why we sometimes take on these risky behaviors or extreme behaviors is quite often they also come with a nice big shot of dopamine, that feel-good chemical.
Ah, right.
So yeah, there's a weird kind of pleasure to taking a risk which pays off.
Right.
You're chasing a high. And then on the other side is obviously people who shrink back, that they don't want to take any risk. But both of those are what I'd still call biased decisions. They're still not people operating optimally.
Because they're operating out of a stress state.
Yeah, and certainly one of the things that you do find is that there's a far more instant gratification. And I think that's probably more important than which way they go with a risk decision, is are they thinking long-term or short-term? And this is an interesting kind of point here, because we have a lot of people in extreme fear and pessimism over the future, and they're talking long-term, but are they actually thinking long-term? Or are their actions more short-term?
Right.
I'm not going to go any further into that because I'm now on very sticky ground. It is interesting. It's really interesting looking at how our stress states firstly link to the uncertain environment around us. And we certainly have that. I think everybody you talk to goes, oh my word, the world seems to be moving so fast, or I don't understand this part, or wow, the future's so uncertain. We're hearing all those phrases so much in common language. And therefore, that relationship, let's again bring this back to our wiring, your brain and my brain, and everyone else's brain. We didn't get to be this state in the evolutionary cycle, is this human with all these different abilities and everything else, by responding to an event as it happens. Your brain and my brain, everyone else's brain, is actually an anticipatory device. It's working on what it thinks happening tomorrow, not what now. And this is where we can really, once we get into those kind of very pessimistic and negative outlooks, you actually see a change in physiology. You actually see your brain rewire itself.
Wow.
And this is where a lot of things which we've overlooked as woo-woo in the past, gratitude journals, deep breathing, chanting, singing, they all actually have massive impacts on our physiology. And as our physiology and brain are connected, it has a massive impact on our thinking.
Wow. That's such important stuff, and so important to consider at that species frame, at that evolutionary, millions of years evolutionary, but societally evolutionary level of are evolving the way we live and work and survive together. This chronic stress is likely at the root of a lot of things that we, from a domain standpoint, they grew up independently, but the roots are intertwined.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, such an important framing for it. And I appreciate that. Before I let you go, I'd love to hear any advice you might have for innovators.
Yeah, I think it's really just kind of, I'm going to just summarize what we've said. That if you want to be an innovator, if you want to progress humanity, which I think is one of the biggest causes you can do, then controlling how you think, understanding that there is this intricate and delicate communication that we ignore too often between ourselves and our thinking. And just getting used to that. I mean, basically, as I said earlier, I think one of the biggest skills in the future is going to be our ability to withstand and even navigate and thrive in uncertainty. At the moment, we're not particularly good at it.
Wow. Partly
because we have all these other things in our modern world which are pushing our kind of stress levels up anyway. And then you add uncertainty on top, and it's just like, whoa, this is too much. I mean, we could take the great toilet paper panic at the beginning of COVID. That was essentially people who couldn't handle uncertainty, hoarding behavior. But in an innovation world, you are dealing essentially with fast-moving concepts, dynamic concepts. You're moving with the world underneath you. You really are coming into this idea of impermanence, that the world under you is not stable. It's not solid, and it's in flux. One of the things that I persuade people to do is just, on my site, I have a very quick uncertainty quiz to test how much uncertainty you can handle. It's only a 10 multiple choice quiz. It's a bit of fun. You can get it just by going to theuncertaintyscientist.com. And, that's a baseline. Everyone can improve from there. Even if you come out of that 100%, that doesn't mean that's your maximum. It just means you've beaten my test. But coming back to this idea and that framework, you've got to pause to understand yourself. understand where you are, because you've got to understand that where your body is dictating how you see the world and what information you take in. Then once you've sorted that, you can then move on to what information am I using to make my decision? And then actually the decision from there becomes far clearer. That's, to me, is resilience as well, because it allows bad things to happen and you still be in control. Resilience is not the absence of emotions. Resilience is the emotions rise and you know what to do with them.
Wow. Chris Marshall, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Innovation is human nature. So many great thoughts. And I appreciate you joining us from lovely North Wales and sharing your insights and your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at Outlast LLC, OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.